My name is Walter Boone. I am 70 years old and I live on a quiet farm in the rolling hills just outside Asheville, North Carolina. When I walked into that courtroom, my daughter smirked, and my son-in-law shook his head with open contempt. I was wearing my plain country clothes, worn-out leather boots, and I held a battered canvas hat in my hands. I looked like a lost farmer, a confused old man who had wandered into the wrong building. I watched Renee lean over and whisper something to Bradley, and he smiled with that particular arrogance that had always defined him. I heard her muffled laugh, a small, cruel sound that cut through my chest like a blade. To them I was an embarrassment, an inconvenience, a silly old fool who had no business standing in a court of law. But then the judge looked up, his eyes met mine, and I watched the color drain from his face as his hand began to tremble on the wooden gavel. His lips moved, and he whispered something that silenced the entire courtroom. "My God," he said. "Is it really him?" Every head turned toward me. The silence grew so thick I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Renee stopped smiling. Bradley frowned, confused, staring at the judge as if the man had lost his mind. They had no idea who I truly was, not until that moment. Before I tell you how we all ended up in that courtroom, let me ask you a small favor. If you are connecting with my story, please hit the like button to bring a little sunshine to this old father's heart. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss my next life stories, and tell me in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is there right now. It makes me genuinely happy to know which corner of the country or the world is listening to me tonight. It all started 3 months ago, on what was supposed to be a peaceful Thursday afternoon at my farm in the hills north of Asheville. Since my beautiful wife Eleanor passed away 2 years ago, this land had been my entire world. 40 acres of pasture and apple trees, a white farmhouse with a wraparound porch, a small barn, and a garden Eleanor had planted with her own hands. It was a sanctuary far from the noise of the city, a place where I could tend the vegetables, feed the chickens, and sit on the porch in the evenings, remembering the good decades Eleanor and I had shared. After she died, I let go of things. I handed the complicated financial chores over to my son-in-law, Bradley Sinclair. He was a sharp, fast-talking venture capitalist who had married my daughter Renee 10 years earlier. He wore tailored suits, drove imported cars, and spoke in the confident language of quarterly returns. I trusted them completely. They were my blood, they were my family. That Thursday afternoon, I walked down the long dirt driveway to check the mailbox. Among the grocery flyers and the seed catalogs, there was a thick envelope stamped in bright red ink. Urgent. It was from the Buncombe County Tax Assessor's Office. I tore it open, expecting a routine receipt. Instead, the bold black letters at the top of the page made the breath catch in my throat. Final notice of default, property tax delinquency, imminent foreclosure warning. I stood there in the driveway while the autumn wind turned to ice against my skin. I read the document 3 times. It stated that my property taxes were 90 days past due, and that if the balance was not settled by the end of the month, the county would begin proceedings to seize the farm. My farm. The home where Eleanor and I had planned to spend our final days. It made no sense at all. Exactly 1 month earlier, I had transferred $35,000 directly into Bradley's account, specifically to cover those property taxes. He had assured me over a family dinner that everything was handled, that I should not trouble my retired mind with paperwork and wire transfers. I pulled out my phone and dialed Renee. My hands were shaking, not from age, but from a sharp spike of adrenaline. She answered on the 4th ring, her voice carrying the background hum of some upscale downtown restaurant. "Hi, Dad. I'm in the middle of a lunch meeting. Can I call you back?" "Renee, I need to know why I just received a foreclosure warning from the county tax office," I said, keeping my voice as level as I could manage. "I gave Bradley the money for the taxes 4 weeks ago. What is going on?" There was a long pause on the line. The restaurant noise seemed to muffle, as if she had cupped her hand over the phone. "Dad, calm down," she said, her tone dripping with that patronizing sweetness people use to soothe a frightened child. "Bradley handled it. You probably got a delayed automated letter. Don't worry about it. We'll come over tonight and sort everything out. Just rest." They arrived at the farm just after sunset. The headlights of Bradley's sleek black sedan swept across the front porch where I stood waiting. Bradley stepped out first, wearing an expensive charcoal suit, looking entirely unbothered. Renee followed, clutching a designer handbag, her face arranged into an expression of exhausted patience. I led them into the living room and placed the default notice on the coffee table between us. "Explain this to me, Bradley," I said, pointing at the bold red ink. Bradley did not even pick up the paper. He sighed, unbuttoned his jacket, and settled back onto my sofa with an arrogant ease. "Walter, you're getting worked up over nothing," he said smoothly. "I paid the taxes weeks ago. The county is notoriously slow at updating their records. You know how these government offices operate." "This letter was printed 3 days ago," I countered, tapping the date at the top of the page. "It says explicitly that no payment has been received. If you paid it, show me the bank confirmation right now." Bradley exchanged a quick, exasperated glance with Renee. It was a look that said, "Here we go again with the crazy old man." "Dad, stop interrogating him," Renee snapped, placing a perfectly manicured hand on her husband's shoulder. "He's doing you a favor by managing your accounts. You've been forgetting everything lately. You're confused." "I am not confused, Renee. I am reading a legal document." "You are confused, Dad." She raised her voice just enough to dominate the room, her eyes locking onto mine, cold and unyielding. "Do you not realize how bad your memory has gotten? Last week you forgot the name of my new dog. 2 days ago you called me asking what day it was. And yesterday—" She paused, letting out a dramatic, trembling breath. "Yesterday we stopped by while you were napping, and the gas stove had been left on. The whole kitchen smelled like a leak. You could have blown up the house and died, Dad. We had to shut it off and open all the windows. The room went dead silent. The only sound was the ticking of the old grandfather clock in the hallway." I stared at my daughter and felt the ground beneath my boots turn to ash. The gas stove. For one fraction of a second, my mind played tricks on me. I imagined the smell of gas. I remembered the warmth of that kitchen. Eleanor used to stand at that exact stove, humming along to old jazz records while she simmered her famous Sunday pot roast. The smell of garlic and rosemary used to fill these wise walls and make this empty house feel like a home. But when Eleanor lost her battle with illness 2 years ago, the music stopped, the cooking stopped. I looked toward the kitchen archway, and the truth stood up inside me like a witness taking the stand. I had not turned on that gas stove in exactly 2 years. I lived on cold sandwiches, microwave meals, and coffee from an electric percolator. I had even shut off the main gas valve behind the appliance months ago because I had no use for it. It was physically impossible for me to have left that stove burning yesterday. A terrifying, icy realization washed over me. I was not losing my mind. My daughter was deliberately lying to my face. Why? Why would she invent a story about me nearly blowing up the house? Why did Bradley look so utterly calm about a missing $35,000? I studied their faces again. Renee was performing the role of a distraught, concerned daughter flawlessly. Bradley was playing the patient, misunderstood son-in-law. If I had been an ordinary grieving old farmer, I would have broken right there. I would have apologized for my failing memory. I would have surrendered my independence to them on the spot. But they had forgotten one crucial detail about my past. Before I moved to this farm, before I became the quiet old man who tended chickens, I spent 30 years as a federal prosecutor. I had stared across tables into the eyes of the most ruthless, manipulative, white-collar criminals in the country. I knew exactly what a lie looked like. I knew the subtle flicker in the eyes of a cornered sociopath. And I was seeing those exact expressions right now on the faces of my own family. Every instinct screamed at me to throw them out, to demand my money, to rip the truth out of them. But the old prosecutor inside me spoke in a colder voice. If I confronted them now, without proof, they would simply escalate the narrative. My anger would become evidence of my supposed instability. To win this war, I had to play their game. I had to let them believe they had already won. So I let my shoulders slump. I forced my hands to tremble a little more visibly. I dropped my gaze to the floor and put on the posture of a defeated, bewildered old man. I left the stove on," I murmured, letting my voice crack. "Yes, Dad," Renee said, her tone instantly softening into syrup. "It terrified us. You're getting older. The grief is catching up with you. You can't handle all this stress anymore." I nodded slowly, keeping my eyes down so she could not see the rage burning behind them. "You might be right," I whispered. I'm just so tired." Bradley stood and buttoned his jacket with a satisfied smirk. "Don't worry about the tax notice, Walter. I'll call the county office on Monday and clear up their clerical error. You just focus on resting. We'll take care of everything." They walked out the front door, leaving me alone in the quiet farmhouse. I stood at the window and watched their taillights disappear down the dark road. And as they vanished, my sadness evaporated, replaced by a cold, hardened resolve. They thought I was a clueless old man waiting to die. They thought they could steal my money and gaslight me into a nursing home. They had just woken a sleeping lion. The hunt had officially begun. The next morning, before the sun had crested the ridge, Renee appeared at the farm. She walked into my kitchen carrying a small amber prescription bottle with no label, and she set it on the counter beside my coffee maker with a soft, patronizing smile. "Dad, I spoke with Dr. Hargrove this morning," she said, pouring me a cup of coffee. "He agrees with Bradley and me. The grief and the isolation are taking a toll on your cognitive functions. He prescribed these vitamins to support your memory and keep you sharp." I stared at the little bottle. It looked innocent enough, a plastic cylinder full of small white capsules. But a voice in the back of my head, a very old and very cynical voice that had once interrogated mob accountants and embezzlers, whispered a single command. "Do not take them." I knew I should listen. That instinct had never failed me in 3 decades of courtrooms. But she was my daughter. She was the little girl I had taught to ride a bicycle, the teenager I had proudly driven to college, the bride I had walked down the aisle. How could I let my paranoid prosecutor's brain accuse my own flesh and blood of poisoning me over a story about a gas stove? I convinced myself that the stress of the foreclosure notice was making me jumpy. I told myself that family deserved trust. So I unscrewed the cap, shook out a capsule, and swallowed it with my coffee. Renee beamed. She kissed me on the cheek, grabbed her coat, and drove back to the city. She promised she would text me every single morning to make sure I took my medicine. And for the sake of family peace, I did exactly as I was told. Within 2 weeks, my entire physical reality began to warp into a nightmare. It started as a subtle heaviness behind my eyes, a dark, muddy fog that settled over my brain by mid-morning. I used to wake at 5 every day to tend the garden and read the financial pages. By the end of the first week on those pills, I was struggling to drag myself out of bed before 10. My legs felt as if they were filled with wet sand. I would sit on the edge of the mattress gasping for air like a drowning man. Then came the tremors. I noticed them first while trying to sign a delivery receipt for chicken feed. My hand shook so violently that the pen slipped from my fingers and clattered onto the porch. The delivery driver looked at me with a deep, uncomfortable pity, the kind of look you give a dying animal. It made my stomach turn. By the second week, the mental fog had thickened into a wall. Thoughts would form in my head, sharp and clear, and then dissolve into static before I could speak them. I caught myself staring at the living room wall for hours, unable to remember what I had meant to do. The legal mind that had spent decades outsmarting the most devious criminals in the country was being ground down into mush. I felt like a prisoner trapped inside a failing body. Every memory of Eleanor, every detail of our life together, felt painfully distant and unreachable. But through all of that suffocating fog, one thought kept piercing the haze like a lighthouse beam. The tax notice. Bradley had promised to fix the county's so-called error. He had sworn my $35,000 was exactly where it needed to be. I needed to see my bank statements with my own eyes. I needed to trace that wire transfer myself. One quiet afternoon, I sat down at the kitchen table and pulled my laptop toward me. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, shaking uncontrollably. It took me 3 attempts just to type the address of my bank. The bright screen glared back at me, mocking my sudden incompetence. I entered my username. Then I moved to the password field, and my mind went completely blank. I had used the same password for 5 years. It was Eleanor's maiden name combined with our anniversary year. A sequence burned into my memory like a brand. But when I reached into the filing cabinet of my mind, the drawer was empty. Nothing, just white noise. I typed what I thought was the password, incorrect. I tried a variation. Incorrect. My hands were shaking so badly I was striking the wrong keys. I hit enter a 3rd time and a red warning box flashed across the screen. Your account has been temporarily locked due to multiple failed login attempts. Please contact customer service. I shoved the laptop away, my heart hammering against my ribs, and grabbed my phone to call the bank's service line. The automated voice asked for my account number. I read the 16 digits off my debit card. Then came the next prompt. Please enter your 4-digit telephone security PIN. I froze. 4 digits. Just four numbers that I knew the way I knew my own name, and they would not come. I punched in the year I became a federal prosecutor. Incorrect, 2 attempts remaining. I tried Eleanor's birth month and day. Incorrect, 1 attempt remaining before the account would be frozen. I lowered the phone from my ear. My chest heaved. I looked down at my shaking hands, and they belonged to a stranger, to some feeble old man. They did not look like the hands that had once slammed indictments onto mahogany tables and demanded justice. I ended the call and let the phone drop to the table, and for the first time since Eleanor died, I felt truly, completely terrified. I was locked out of my own money. I had no way to verify whether Bradley had stolen my $35,000. And worst of all, I was losing the only weapon I had left in this world. My own mind. Renee and Bradley had looked me in the eye and promised those pills would clear my head. But as I sat there trembling, unable to recall a 4-digit number, a chilling clarity sliced through the haze. They were not trying to cure me. They were trying to erase me. The days that followed passed in a blur of agonizing clarity mixed with chemical exhaustion. I knew the pills were poison. But I also knew that if I stopped taking them outright, Renee and Bradley would realize I had discovered their game. I had to maintain the facade. From that day on, I placed each capsule on my tongue when Renee was watching, and the moment her back turned, I tucked it into my cheek and later spat it into my palm. Enough of the drug still lingered in my bloodstream to keep my hands trembling, and my thoughts wading through mud, but the tide had turned. My mind was slowly coming back to me, and I let no one see it. They visited again on a Sunday morning, carrying a box of expensive pastries from a bakery in downtown Asheville. Renee breezed through the front door with her counterfeit cheerfulness, loudly asking how her favorite father was doing. Bradley trailed behind her, checking his watch, radiating impatient obligation. I was standing at the kitchen counter, attempting to pour a cup of black coffee. The ceramic mug felt like it weighed 50 pounds in my performance. "Here, let me help you with that, Dad," Renee said, stepping forward with a mask of deep concern. "I can do it," I muttered, making my voice frail. I lifted the mug, let my hand shake violently, and allowed the hot liquid to slosh over the rim. Then I let the mug slip. It shattered against the hardwood floor, spraying coffee and ceramic shards across the kitchen. "Oh, for heaven's sake," Bradley sighed heavily. "I'm sorry," I whispered, dropping to my knees. I fumbled blindly at the broken pieces, exaggerating the tremor in my fingers, keeping my head bowed, playing the pathetic, ruined old farmer they so desperately wanted me to be. "Don't cut yourself, Dad," Renee said, her voice laced with imitation sympathy. "Just leave it. I'll get the mop." She walked off toward the utility closet down the hall. I stayed on the floor, carefully picking up a sharp curve of ceramic, and from that position I had a perfect view of the sliding stained glass door that led to the back patio. The morning sun struck the glass at just the right angle, turning it into a dark mirror. In that reflection, I saw Bradley standing behind me, leaning against the kitchen island. He was not looking down at me with pity. His face was twisted into a sneer of open, undisguised disgust. Cold, calculating, impatient. Renee returned with the mop and paused beside her husband, looking down at me as I fumbled with the shards. Bradley leaned close to her ear, and although his voice was barely a hiss, the quiet kitchen carried every syllable straight to me. "He's practically useless now," he whispered, his eyes fixed on my shaking back. "It won't be long." Renee did not scold him. She did not defend her father. She gave a short, silent nod of agreement and handed him a paper towel. As I stared at their reflection, a profound stillness settled over my mind. The chemical fog burned away in a single flash of pure rage. The trembling in my hands stopped entirely, and I had to consciously restart it. I knelt there on my own kitchen floor, clutching a broken piece of the mug Eleanor had bought at a county fair, and let the audacity of those words sink into my bones. "He is practically useless now." That look of arrogant contempt on Bradley's face flipped a switch buried 30 years deep. It was the exact expression I used to see on Wall Street fraudsters in the moments before I dismantled their lives. Men who believed their slick words made them untouchable. Men who smiled right up until the second I laid irrefutable evidence in front of a judge and watched the color drain from their faces. For 30 years, I had been the apex predator in those courtrooms. I built cases so airtight that defense attorneys advised their clients to plead guilty rather than face me at trial. When Eleanor died, I packed that man away. I traded tailored suits for flannel shirts and legal briefs for garden tools. I wanted peace, I wanted rest, but kneeling on that floor, listening to my son-in-law pronounce me useless, I understood that my retirement had been read as weakness. I was not a sick old man. I was a target, hunted by amateurs. They believed they had found a vulnerable widower with a thick bank account and a fading memory. They believed they could drug me into compliance, strip my estate, and warehouse me in some cheap facility to rot. They had made a catastrophic miscalculation. I let out a ragged, pathetic sigh, restarted the tremor in my hands, and slowly pushed myself up from the floor. "I'm so sorry, Renee," I stammered. "I just can't seem to hold on to anything today." "It's okay, Dad," she said, the fake smile snapping back into place. "That's why we're here. Go sit in your recliner and rest. I'll clean up this mess." I shuffled to the living room, dragging my feet exactly the way a heavily sedated man would, and sank into my old leather armchair. Behind my closed eyes, my mind was running at 1,000 miles an hour. I could not confront them yet. I needed evidence, a paper trail, a prosecution case so devastating that neither of them would ever recover. The first piece of evidence I needed was sitting in an amber bottle on my kitchen counter. 2 days later, I told Renee over the phone that I was going to nap all afternoon. Instead, I climbed into my old pickup truck and drove 40 minutes north to a small rural clinic in Weaverville, a place with no connection to my family, my name, or my regular doctors. I paid in cash. I handed the physician one of the white capsules and a vial of my own blood, and I asked him quietly and precisely to tell me exactly what was inside both. Driving home, I nearly ruined everything. I had lost track of time, and Renee always called the kitchen landline at noon sharp to monitor my condition. If I missed her call, she would panic and send Bradley to the farm, and they would discover a lucid, capable man running an investigation behind their backs. I pushed that rattling truck past every speed limit on the rural highway, pines blurring past the windows, and skidded into my driveway with the phone already ringing through the kitchen window. I sprinted across the yard, tore open the screen door, and snatched the receiver off the wall on the sixth and final ring. I pressed the phone to my chest for 1 second, slowed my heart, and answered in a trembling rasp. "Hello, Dad." Renee's voice barked through the speaker. "I was about to send Bradley out there. Is everything all right?" "I'm sorry, sweetheart," I mumbled, forcing a weak chuckle. "I was on the porch. It took me a minute to remember where the ringing was coming from. My legs are so heavy today. I think the medicine is making me sleepy." She let out a sigh, and the tension in her voice dissolved back into artificial sweetness. "Oh, Dad, you need to be careful. The vitamins are doing their job, helping your brain heal. Did you take your morning dose?" I looked at the capsule hidden in my shirt pocket. "Yes, Renee," I whispered. "I took it exactly like you told me. I'm following all your instructions." "Good," she replied. "Bradley and I will come by this weekend. Just stay in the house, Dad. We'll handle everything from here." I hung up the phone and let the facade fall away completely. I stood tall in the center of my quiet kitchen, breathing steadily, my old mind sharp and clear. The trap was being built, and the hunters had no idea they were walking into a cage. The clinic called the next afternoon, just past 2 o'clock. The doctor did not bother with pleasantries. His voice was tight with professional alarm. He asked if I was sitting down. I told him I was standing, and that my mind was perfectly clear and ready for whatever he had to say. The pills my daughter had been feeding me were not vitamins. They did not contain a trace of any dietary supplement. They were a concentrated generic formulation of a potent antipsychotic, a drug designed for extreme cases of acute schizophrenia, and the dosage packed into those capsules was dangerously high for a man of my age. He explained that flooding a healthy brain with heavy neuroleptics would rapidly mimic the late stages of severe dementia. Artificial tremors, profound confusion, memory blockages, a crushing lethargy that traps the patient inside his own failing body. He warned me that prolonged exposure could cause irreversible neurological damage or trigger a fatal cardiac event. He urged me to call the police immediately and offered to forward his lab results to the sheriff's office. I thanked him for his diligence. I politely declined to involve the police just yet, and I asked him to mail a certified physical copy of the lab report to a private post office box I kept under a different name. I hung up the phone, and the silence of that kitchen was deafening. My own daughter. My own flesh and blood. She had smiled into my face, kissed my cheek, and handed me the chemical chains meant to drag me into a padded room. The betrayal was so absolute, so profoundly evil, that it moved beyond anger. It hardened into a cold, unbreakable sheet of tactical resolve. Later, when the whole conspiracy finally lay open in the light, I would learn where those pills had come from. Bradley's venture capital firm was drowning. He had burned through his investors' money and gone crawling to a shadow lending syndicate operating out of Atlanta, the kind of men who do not file lawsuits when a debt goes unpaid. Those same connections had supplied him with bulk pharmaceuticals through a corrupt distributor. No prescriptions, no records, no questions. My daughter had not stumbled into this scheme. She had ordered the poison the way other people order groceries. But that afternoon, I only knew one thing for certain. This was no longer a family dispute. This was attempted murder in slow motion, and I was going to prosecute it like one. I knew Renee had a corporate media launch that afternoon, which meant Bradley would be assigned the daily welfare check. He arrived just before 5, gravel crunching under the tires of his sedan. I watched from the kitchen window as he stepped out, adjusted his Italian wool coat, and surveyed my property with the calculating eyes of a developer measuring a vacant lot. He climbed the porch steps and let himself in without knocking, using the spare key I had foolishly given them years ago. I shuffled into the living room ahead of him, slumped into my armchair, and stared blankly at the cold fireplace, mouth slightly open, playing the heavily sedated father to perfection. Bradley stopped a few feet from my chair. He did not ask how I was feeling. He pulled a sleek leather notebook from his breast pocket and jotted something down. "Walter," he said, loud and condescending, "did you take your afternoon dose? Renee said you sounded out of sorts on the phone. We need to make sure you're staying on top of your regimen." I turned my head slowly, blinking as if struggling to focus. "Yes," I murmured, letting my voice crack. "I took them. But my head feels so heavy today, Bradley. Everything is spinning." He let out a short, dismissive sigh, clearly annoyed by my existence. "The doctor said it takes time for your brain chemistry to balance out. Just sit quietly and let the medication do its work." As he spoke, his cell phone rang, and he reached into the right pocket of his wool coat to retrieve it. When he pulled the phone out, the fabric of the pocket gaped open just long enough for me to catch a glint of metal in the afternoon light. A small, uniquely shaped brass key on a heavy silver ring. I recognized it instantly. It was the master key to the floor safe, hidden beneath the false panel in my study. A month earlier, when I had first noticed that key missing from my nightstand, Renee had spent an hour helping me search the house. She had held my hands, looked into my eyes, and gently told me that my memory was failing, that I must have misplaced it during one of my confused episodes. She had used my own stolen property as the first brick in her wall of gaslighting. And all along, the key had been riding around in her husband's pocket. Inside that safe were the original deeds to the farm, bearer bonds, and the complete legal architecture of my estate. If they had the key, they were already inside my vault, dismantling my life from within. I needed that key back, and I needed it now, but I could not simply demand it. The moment I revealed that I knew, the entire performance of my dementia would collapse, and with it, my only advantage. So I reached back 30 years to a skill I never imagined I would use in my own living room. In the late 80s, I had spearheaded a federal takedown of an organized crime network operating along the East Coast. To build that case, I relied on a street-level informant named Louis, a master pickpocket who had turned state's evidence. During our long hours in the safe house, Louis had taught me the mechanics of what he called the dip. Successful theft, he explained, was never about speed. It was about misdirection. You create a sudden physical shock, an overwhelming point of contact that floods the target's senses and blinds him to the small movement of your hands. I gripped the armrests of my chair and began pushing myself up, letting my legs shake violently. "Bradley," I gasped. "I need water." He rolled his eyes and stepped toward me. "Just sit down, Walter. I'll get it from the kitchen." As he reached out to press me back into the chair, I executed the maneuver. I let my eyes roll back. I let every ounce of tension drain out of my knees, simulating a sudden, massive fainting spell, and my dead weight collapsed forward directly into him. He grunted in surprise, his phone tumbling onto the carpet, as both his arms wrapped instinctively around my torso to catch me. His hands clamped my shoulders. His entire nervous system was consumed by the shock of my falling body. In that exact second, my right hand slipped smoothly and silently into the open pocket of his coat. My fingers found the cold brass. I pinched the key between my index and middle finger, and drew it out in one fluid, practiced motion, tucking it into the waistband of my trousers and pulling my sweater down over it. The entire extraction took less than 2 seconds. "What is wrong with you?" he snapped, wrestling my frame back into the armchair. "Sit down, Walter. Come on." I slumped against the cushions, blinking wildly, letting out a long, ragged breath as if surfacing from unconsciousness. "I'm sorry," I whispered. The room just went black. I felt so dizzy. Bradley brushed off his coat with a look of utter revulsion, bent down for his fallen phone, and never noticed that his pocket was lighter. "This is exactly why you can't be left alone anymore," he muttered, typing a rapid message on his screen. "You're becoming a liability. I'll get you some tap water. And then I have to leave. I have a meeting." He turned his back and marched toward the kitchen, and the moment he was out of sight, I drew the brass key from my waistband. The metal was heavy and cold against my palm, its sharp edges pressing into my skin. It was not just a piece of metal, it was proof that they were already inside my vault. Bradley returned, shoved a glass of water onto the side table, and ordered me to drink it and stay in the chair. "Renee will call you tonight." I nodded slowly, hands folded over the stolen key in my lap. "Thank you, Bradley," I murmured. "You're a good son." He sneered, turned on his heel, and walked out the front door. I listened to his engine start, listened to his tires crunch down the driveway, and did not move a muscle until the sound had faded completely into the hills. Then I sat up straight. The tremors vanished, the weakness evaporated. I looked down at the brass key in my palm, and the rage simmering in my chest crystallized into pure, unadulterated purpose. That evening I drove to a hardware store on the edge of town and had an exact copy cut. And the following day, during another feigned stumble as Bradley steadied me in the hallway, I slipped the duplicate back into his coat pocket. He would never know his key had ever left him. But now, every time he used it, he would be turning a key I had already cataloged as evidence. They had poisoned my body. They had insulted my intelligence. They were robbing my vault. The time for hiding was over. It was time to strike back, and every piece of evidence I gathered from this night forward would be a nail in their proverbial coffins. I waited until the sun dipped below the tree line, and the farm was wrapped in total darkness. I knew better than to use the landline or my personal cell phone. People bold enough to drug me and copy the key to my safe were certainly capable of monitoring my call logs. During my trip to the clinic in Weaverville, I had bought a cheap prepaid phone with a handful of cash. I pulled the small plastic device from my boot, powered it on, and dialed a number I had memorized more than 20 years ago. The line rang twice before a deep, gravelly voice answered. Marcus Delaney. Marcus was a titan of civil litigation, a man who moved through courtrooms with the precision of a surgeon and the ruthlessness of a shark. We had fought on opposite sides of the aisle many times during my years as a federal prosecutor, and over the decades, that rivalry had melted into a profound, unspoken respect. He was the only man alive I could trust with a secret of this magnitude. "Marcus," I said quietly, "it's Walter Boone. I'm on an unregistered phone. Do not return a call to my primary number." There was a brief pause. "Walter." His tone shifted instantly from casual to strictly business. "You don't buy burner phones to chat about the weather. What's happening?" I laid out the facts with the clinical detachment of a man reading an indictment. The foreclosure notice, the $35,000, the antipsychotics disguised as vitamins, confirmed by an independent lab, the stolen safe key riding in Bradley's pocket. I offered no emotional commentary. I gave him evidence. And I reminded him that if this failed, I would lose everything I had built, my land and my freedom. Marcus was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a quiet, terrifying anger. "They're setting you up for a fraudulent conservatorship, Walter. They're manufacturing medical proof of your incompetence, so they can seize your assets through the courts. We need to document their actions immediately. I need eyes inside my own house," I told him. "I need to catch Bradley opening that safe, but it has to be completely off the books. No commercial security companies, no paper trails they can find. I have a private technical team," Marcus assured me. "Former federal surveillance specialists who work exclusively for my firm. Discreet and fast. I'll send them to your farm tonight. Leave the back door unlocked." The hours before midnight crawled by with agonizing slowness. I sat in the dark living room watching moonlight filter through the curtains, running every legal scenario through my head. I was no longer a father trying to understand his child. I was an investigator building a trap. Precisely at midnight, two unmarked sedans rolled silently up my dirt driveway, headlights extinguished. Three men in dark, nondescript clothing slipped out and moved swiftly to my back porch, gloved, carrying gear bags that looked perfectly ordinary from the outside. I let them in. They asked no questions and offered no pleasantries. They simply went to work with a quiet professionalism that put me instantly at ease. The lead technician, a tall man with sharp eyes, handed me an encrypted tablet and explained the plan. They would embed military-grade micro-cameras directly into the architectural molding of the living room and the study, lenses no larger than the head of a pin, invisible to the naked eye. The video feeds would be encrypted and uploaded to a secure server at Marcus's firm. If Bradley or Renee set foot in this house, every movement and every whisper would be captured and preserved as irrefutable legal evidence. I led them to the study first and pointed to the heavy oak bookshelves along the far wall. The floor safe lay hidden beneath a false section of hardwood directly below the bottom shelf. The technicians nodded and began drilling microscopic holes into the crown molding, routing hair, thin wires behind the plaster. I watched them in the dim lamplight, feeling a strange mixture of relief and profound sorrow. I was turning my own sanctuary into a surveillance land zone to catch my daughter committing a felony. The weight of that fact pressed down on my chest, but I pushed the emotion aside. This was a war of survival. The installation proved far more complicated than anticipated. The century-old plaster and dense oak beams of my farmhouse fought their modern tools. What should have been a rapid 45-minute operation stretched past 90. They had finished wiring the study and were working in the living room, the mantelpiece partially detached from the wall, tools scattered across the rug, when the silent alarm triggered. It was exactly 1:45 in the morning. A small blue light flashed on the monitor beside my front door, wired to the motion sensor I had installed years ago at the entrance of the driveway to track delivery trucks. Someone had just turned onto my property. A cold knot formed in my stomach. I pulled up the live feed from the gate camera, and my blood ran cold. A sleek black luxury SUV was creeping up the driveway, moving slowly so the gravel would not betray it. The license plate was unmistakable. Renee. My mind raced to decode her motive, and the answer hit me like a physical blow. The evening dose. I had flushed my nighttime pill hours ago, but in the chaos of coordinating with Marcus and the surveillance team, I had forgotten to send her the confirmation text. Renee, obsessed with keeping my bloodstream flooded with those drugs, had driven out here in the dead of night to force the pill down my throat herself. The stakes she was playing for were absolute, and so was her commitment. I spun to face the technicians. "We have a vehicle approaching," I whispered sharply. "You have 2 minutes before she reaches the front door." The three men moved instantly, rolling up exposed wires and sweeping equipment into their duffel bags. But the living room was a crime scene of white plaster dust across dark hardwood, and the mantel still sat crooked against the wall. There was no way they could pack, clean, and vanish before Renee walked in. Her headlights were already sweeping across the front windows. I heard her tires stop directly behind the unmarked sedans. She would see those cars. She would see the dust. The entire prosecution would crumble before I had filed a single document. I needed to buy them time. I needed a distraction so disturbing that she would forget the strange cars, forget the state of the living room, and focus every ounce of her attention on me. "Go out the back window," I ordered the lead technician. "Don't stop moving until you reach the tree line. I'll handle her." The heavy slam of her car door echoed through the cold night air. Her heels began clicking up the stone walkway. I had 10 seconds. I had to become the broken, helpless old man she believed she had created, and I had to do it outside, before her hand ever touched the doorknob. I threw open the front door and stepped out into the freezing night, wearing nothing but thin cotton pajamas. The cold hit my bare skin like a hammer, and I welcomed it, because it made every physical reaction genuine. I began to shiver violently, teeth chattering, and stumbled barefoot down the wooden steps onto the frozen gravel, wandering aimlessly toward her blinding headlights. I widened my eyes into hollow terror. I let my jaw hang slack. I became a man whose mind had detached completely from reality, wandering blind through a shattered memory. Renee killed the engine and slammed her door. "What on earth are you doing out here, Walter?" She snapped, not even bothering with the word Dad. Her voice was sharp with cold irritation. "Get back inside this instant. Are you trying to catch pneumonia? I did not look at her. I stared past her shoulder into the dark woods and raised a trembling hand, pointing at nothing. Eleanor? I wailed, letting my voice crack with pathetic desperation. Eleanor, is that you? Where have you been? I can't find the keys, Eleanor. The house is so cold. Renee stopped dead in her tracks. The sheer scale of my apparent delusion caught her completely off guard. She stared at me, shivering in the frost, barefoot on jagged stones, crying out for a woman who had been buried for 2 years. And then, I watched something happen that told me everything I would ever need to know about my daughter's heart. The irritation on her face melted into a twisted, victorious satisfaction. She believed her pills had finally pushed me over the edge. She pulled her phone from her coat pocket, raised it, and began recording me. She captured my bare feet on the ice, my trembling hands grasping at ghosts, my broken voice calling for my dead wife. I understood instantly what that video was for. It was not concern, it was evidence for whatever she was building against me. So I gave her a performance worth filing. Every second she spent recording her demented father was another second Marcus's team had to vanish into the forest. Diane is dead, she said coldly, lowering the phone and grabbing my arm. Her fingernails dug through the thin fabric of my sleeve. You're confused. Move your feet. I planted my bare feet in the freezing gravel and let my body go limp, forcing her to bear my whole weight. No, I pleaded, shaking my head frantically. I have to wait for her. She's coming right back. Don't make me go inside. It isn't safe in there. The shadows are moving. The men in the walls are watching me. The irony of my words was not lost on me, but to Renee it was simply another symptom of psychotic paranoia. She yanked her arm away, repulsed. You're hallucinating, Walter. There's no one in the walls. Now walk. I dragged my feet, forcing her to haul me inch by inch up the porch steps, counting the seconds in my head. 10, 20, 30. I tripped deliberately over the top step and sprawled hard across the wooden deck, gasping, letting the bitter cold soak into my bones. And then my daughter did something I will carry to my grave. She kicked my leg. A sharp, contemptuous strike, the way you would kick a stray dog blocking a doorway. I said, "Get up," she hissed, leaning down until her face was inches from mine. You are not going to ruin my plans tonight. You are going to go inside, you are going to take your medication, and you are going to sleep. I pushed myself up, whimpering, and let her drag me through the front door by the collar of my pajama shirt. The warmth of the house washed over me, and I sank against the hallway wall, pulling my knees to my chest, rocking gently. Renee stood over me, panting from the exertion, smoothing down her cashmere coat. She never looked toward the living room. I risked one subtle glance down the hall. The room was dark and still. The tools were gone. The mantel sat flush against the wall. The plaster dust had been hastily swept away. The technicians had vanished like phantoms into the night. Stay right there, she ordered, marching to the kitchen. She returned with a cup of water and a white capsule, crouched to my level, and shoved the pill against my lips. You missed your nighttime dose. Open your mouth and swallow it right now. I whimpered, opened my mouth obediently, placed the pill on my tongue, and swallowed hard, making certain she saw my throat move. She watched me for a full minute to be sure I had not hidden it. What she did not know was that the capsule was already trapped in my cheek, exactly where Louis the pickpocket once taught me a man can hide almost anything. Satisfied, she stood, gave me one final look of disgust, and left. As her taillights disappeared down the road, I spat the pill into my palm. Then I looked up at the crown molding. A tiny red light blinked once and went dark. The cameras were live. The silent hunt for their destruction had officially begun. The following morning broke gray and cold, matching the resolve settling into my bones. I sat at the kitchen island, hands perfectly steady, and powered on the encrypted tablet. The screen divided into crystal clear grids. Every corner of my living room, every shadow of my study, captured through lenses invisible to the naked eye. I called Marcus on the burner. We have secure feeds, he confirmed. My forensic accounting team is monitoring the stream from our dedicated server. Now we wait for your son-in-law to make his move. I did not have to wait long. I texted Renee that I was feeling terribly weak and intended to sleep away the afternoon, knowing she would relay it to Bradley and hand him a perfect window. At exactly 2 o'clock, gravel crunched in the driveway. I sat hidden in my bedroom, eyes fixed on the tablet. The front door opened with a quiet click. Bradley stepped into the hallway, moving with a practiced, predatory caution, stepping lightly to keep the old boards from creaking. He paused at the base of the staircase, listening for any sound from my room. Satisfied that the drugs had me unconscious, he turned and walked directly into the study. The camera in the crown molding captured his face in pristine high definition. There was no hesitation in him. He knew exactly where he was going. I watched the man who married my daughter kneel on Eleanor's antique rug, roll it back, run his fingers along the floorboards, and lift the false panel. The steel door of my safe lay exposed. He drew the brass key from his pocket, the duplicate I had planted on him, slid it into the lock, and pulled the heavy door open. A sickening wave of violation washed over me as I watched his hands reach into my private vault. He drew out the manila folders, the original deed to the farm, the property surveys, the bearer bonds, the full architecture of my financial life. He spread them across my desk like a feast, pulled out his phone, and for the next 20 minutes, the feed recorded Bradley Sinclair meticulously photographing every page. Account numbers, routing codes, signature samples, legal descriptions of every asset I owned. He was building a complete digital replica of my estate. And thanks to Marcus's forensic accountants who were watching the same feed in real time, I soon understood why. This was never just about $35,000 in tax money. That had merely been the loose thread. Over the previous 2 years, Bradley had quietly leveraged his access to my accounts, forging my signature on loan guarantees, pledging my land and my bonds as collateral against his debts to the Atlanta syndicate. The full scheme, once the accountants finished unwinding the shell companies, totaled nearly $15 million. My entire estate, and the syndicate was calling in its markers. Bradley did not just want my farm. He needed it because without it, the men he owed did not accept apologies. I watched him place the folders back into the safe, lock it, replace the floorboard, and roll the rug back into position with the care of a man who had done it many times before. Then he let himself out of my house and drove away. I sat in my bedroom for a long time, staring at the frozen image of my son-in-law's face on the screen. Then I picked up the burner phone and set the endgame in motion. I dialed Renee, shallowing my breath to make my voice frail, and asked her to come to the house that afternoon. I told her I was having a rare good day, a brief window of clarity, and that I needed to discuss something important about the future of the estate. I heard the hesitation in her voice, followed by that familiar calculating shift. She promised to be there by 4. I spent 2 hours preparing the stage. I ruffled my hair, unbuttoned my collar, draped a wool blanket over my knees, and settled into the leather armchair, positioned squarely in the optimal viewing angle of the hidden camera. I was the bait, sitting in the center of my own trap. At 4 o'clock, Renee arrived carrying a plastic grocery bag of cheap canned soup, a pathetic prop of caregiving. She set it on the counter and stopped a few feet from my chair, eyes darting around to confirm we were alone. "You said you were having a clear day, Dad. You sounded serious on the phone. What's going on?" I looked up at her, keeping my hands still to sell the illusion of temporary lucidity, and let my eyes fill with tears. The heartbreak, at least, required no acting. "Renee," I began, letting my voice crack, "I know what's happening to me. I know my mind is slipping away. The fog gets thicker every day. Soon I won't remember my own name, let alone the legacy your mother and I built on this land." I drew a slow, rattling breath, and I've realized I have a responsibility to protect this property before I'm gone entirely. I can't let this farm decay while I sit in a nursing home. I can't burden you and Bradley with the upkeep of this estate. She stepped closer, her posture stiffening, trying to gauge whether this was genuine clarity or another symptom. "Oh, Dad, don't talk like that," she murmured, patting my shoulder with a cold, hesitant hand. "The vitamins are helping, you just need more time." "No, Renee," I said gently, easing my shoulder away from her touch. "We both know the truth. I'm losing the battle. But today, right now, my thoughts are clear." So this morning, I called my estate attorney. I looked directly into her eyes and delivered the blow with surgical precision. I told him to draft the final paperwork. "This coming Monday at 9 o'clock sharp, I am signing the farm, the house, and all the surrounding acreage over to the Southern Appalachian Land Conservancy. They will preserve this land in your mother's name forever. It's the only way to keep it safe from developers and taxes. The estate will be gone, Renee, but it will serve a noble purpose." She stared at me as if I had driven a dagger into her chest. Her breathing turned rapid and shallow. the meticulous, condescending mask she wore so flawlessly shattered before my eyes. She needed this property. Without the farm as collateral, Bradley was a dead man walking, and her entire gilded life would collapse with him. But, Monday, she stammered, eyes wide with pure panic. Dad, you can't do that. You're not thinking clearly. You can't just give away the family inheritance on a whim. Bradley and I have plans for this place. You have to cancel that meeting. I shook my head slowly and let a gentle, resigned smile touch my lips. No, sweetheart, I whispered. My mind is made up. The lawyer files the documents Monday morning. Once my signature is on that paper, the transfer is irrevocable. She took 2 steps backward, physically reeling. Her hands began to shake with the very tremors she had spent a month trying to induce in me. She grabbed her purse from the sofa, unable to form a coherent sentence. I have to go, she gasped, and practically sprinted out the front door, slamming it behind her. I listened to her engine roar down the driveway, and I permitted myself one cold smile. I had given them a deadline, 48 hours before the estate vanished forever. They could not wait. They would have to strike this weekend, in a panic, and panicked people make mistakes. The bait was taken. The predators were rushing headlong into my trap, or so I believed. Friday morning arrived with a deceptive stillness. The heavy clouds had broken, and a pale, thin sunlight washed over the frost-covered pastures. I woke at 5, my mind sharper than it had been in months, the last chemical traces of the antipsychotics gone from my blood. I sat at the kitchen table with hot black coffee, reviewing the overnight surveillance footage on the encrypted tablet. Everything was in place. I had scheduled a final meeting with Marcus for that afternoon to hand over the digital evidence, the certified toxicology report, and the recorded video of Bradley raiding my safe. We were going to file a federal injunction before sunset, freezing every asset and triggering a criminal fraud investigation. I felt a deep, resonant vindication. I was the veteran prosecutor who had lured arrogant amateurs into a fatal legal ambush. But I had severely underestimated the terrifying speed of a desperate man fighting for his life. At exactly 8:15, the morning stillness shattered under the crunch of heavy tires tearing up my gravel driveway. Not one vehicle, a convoy. I walked to the kitchen window, pulled back the curtain, and felt my blood run cold. 3 Buncombe County Sheriff's cruisers sat at aggressive angles across my front lawn, light bars strobing blue and red against the frost. Behind them, a sterile white van bearing the seal of the Department of Social Services blocked the exit. Doors slammed in unison. Uniformed deputies stepped out, adjusting their belts, moving with the practiced tension of officers responding to a volatile situation. 2 civilians with thick clipboards, a man and a woman, flanked them. I stood frozen at the sink. My entire federal case, my meticulously planned counterattack, was still sitting in an encrypted file on the kitchen island, 1 meeting away from being filed. I had played the bait too well. I had forced a ticking clock onto Bradley and Renee, expecting them to try to strong-arm my signature over the weekend. Instead, they had bypassed me entirely. They had picked up the legal system itself and swung it at me like a club. Heavy, authoritative knocks pounded against my front door. I took a deep breath, forcing my racing heart to slow. Whatever was on the other side of that door, the facade had to hold. I ruffled my hair, hunched my shoulders, set a violent tremor loose in my hands, and shuffled to the foyer. A tall sheriff's deputy stood on the porch, flanked by the 2 social workers. "Walter Boone?" he asked in a tone that left no room for debate. "Yes," I stammered, making my voice weak and hopelessly confused. "What's happening? Is there a problem?" The female social worker stepped forward, her face a mask of practiced clinical sympathy. "Mr. Boone, my name is Denise. We're from Adult Protective Services. We've received an emergency court order regarding your immediate welfare and the management of your estate." She handed me a thick stack of stapled legal documents. The heavy black text on the first page hit me with the force of a physical blow. It was an emergency ex-parte conservatorship order, signed and stamped by a county judge just hours earlier. Ex parte, filed and granted in secret, without my knowledge, without my presence, without giving me a single opportunity to defend myself. A legal mechanism reserved strictly for the most extreme, life-threatening cases of mental collapse. I stared at the paperwork, letting my hands shake until the pages rattled. "This can't be right," I whispered. "I'm fine. I'm perfectly fine. I just woke up to drink my coffee." "I'm sorry, sir," the deputy said, his hand resting cautiously on his belt. The judge has temporarily suspended your legal autonomy. You're no longer permitted to make financial or medical decisions for yourself, and you cannot remain on this property unsupervised. We're here to escort you to a secure facility for a mandatory psychiatric evaluation. Before I could respond, another vehicle sped up the driveway. Bradley's sedan. He slammed the brakes, threw it into park, and rushed toward the porch with Renee close behind, a tissue pressed to her face, weeping, playing the devastated daughter to absolute perfection. "Oh, Dad," she sobbed, reaching for my arm. "I'm so sorry it had to come to this. We tried so hard to take care of you at home, but you're slipping away too fast. We had to protect you from yourself." I looked down at the documents trembling in my hands, and the attached exhibits told the whole horrifying story. Bradley had not merely used his syndicate connections for loans and pills. He had used them to purchase forged medical documentation. Stapled to the order were sworn affidavits from 2 out-of-state neurologists, doctors who had never once laid eyes on me, testifying that I suffered from aggressive late-onset dementia. The affidavits described, in clinical detail, the exact symptoms the antipsychotics had carved into my body. The tremors, the lethargy, the confusion, the paranoid outbursts, the wandering barefoot into the freezing night. They had weaponized my own survival tactics against me. Every symptom I had faked to protect my investigation had become a brick in their legal case for my institutionalization. And the video. Renee's phone footage from that frozen night, of her barefoot father grasping at ghosts and calling for his dead wife, had been presented to a judge as tragic proof that I could no longer manage a multi-million-dollar estate. I had told her I was giving the farm away on Monday. She had answered by legally erasing me on Friday morning. "Please, you have to listen to me," I begged, turning to the social worker, dropping my voice into a desperate, panicked plea. "They're lying to you. They've been poisoning me." Denise sighed and offered a sad, patronizing smile. "We know about the medication, Mr. Boone. Your daughter explained that you've been refusing your prescribed treatment and hiding your pills. That's why you're experiencing these paranoid delusions. It's a common symptom of your condition. We're just going to get you some help." Bradley smirked in triumph as the deputies escorted me across the frozen yard toward the waiting van. I lowered my head, partly to play the broken man, and partly to hide the small, subtle smile tugging at the corner of my mouth. They had missed the burner phone. Before loading me into the van, the taller deputy conducted a standard pat-down. He found my smartphone and my ring of house keys and handed them to Denise, who sealed them solemnly into a plastic evidence bag. They were confiscating my life, item by item. But he never checked the deep interior pocket of my heavy wool cardigan, where the small plastic phone sat nestled against my chest. My last remaining lifeline to Marcus and to reality. I stood at the open doors of the van, lower lip trembling, eyes darting in manufactured confusion, and watched Renee stage her farewell performance on the porch. She wept openly into a crumpled tissue while Bradley played the supportive husband at her side. Denise placed a comforting hand on my daughter's shoulder and assured her the facility would keep me safe and that the conservatorship would protect my assets from my deteriorating mind. Renee nodded bravely, wiped away a manufactured tear, and asked if she could have one last moment to say goodbye to her father. Denise smiled gently and stepped aside. The deputies loosened their grip on my arms, granting us the illusion of family privacy. Renee crossed the gravel slowly, her face a portrait of devastation for everyone watching from a distance. But as she drew close, the sorrow drained out of her eyes and was replaced by an icy, triumphant gleam. She stepped into my space and wrapped her arms around my neck in what looked, from 20 feet away, like a desperate and loving embrace. Then she pressed her mouth directly against my ear. Her breath was warm. Her voice was as cold as the frost on the grass. "Don't fight it, Dad," she whispered, each word sliding in like a razor. "You lost. We're in charge now. Go quietly and maybe I'll put you in one of the nicer facilities." She pulled back, kissed me softly on the cheek, and released another loud, dramatic sob for the benefit of the social workers. I let my hands shake. I gave her the satisfaction of believing I was terrified. She turned and walked back to Bradley, burying her face in his chest, and the deputies guided me up into the van. The heavy doors slammed shut, plunging the compartment into dim, sterile light. The lock engaged from outside. The engine rumbled to life, and the van rolled slowly down the long dirt driveway, carrying me away from the only home I had known for 30 years. I sat on the hard plastic bench, listening to the hum of the tires, and as the shock of the ambush faded, a dark and suffocating irony washed over me, one almost too profound to bear. I closed my eyes and let my mind drift back 25 years. During my prime in the federal prosecutor's office, I had been appointed to a special state commission tasked with rewriting North Carolina's conservatorship and adult guardianship statutes. There had been an epidemic in those years, financial predators circling vulnerable seniors, draining estates faster than the courts could react. I spent countless nights at my mahogany desk, poring over precedents, drafting airtight language designed to freeze assets instantly when severe cognitive decline could be proven. I was the one who wrote the emergency ex parte provision. I personally designed the mechanism allowing social services to bypass standard courtroom delays if two physicians signed sworn affidavits establishing an immediate threat to a vulnerable patient. I stood before the state legislature and argued passionately that rapid intervention was the only way to save victims, before scammers could empty their lives. It was considered my legal masterpiece, a shield for the defenseless, and now my own daughter had turned my masterpiece into a weapon. She had taken my words, my statutes, my legacy, and used the exact legal framework I built to orchestrate the perfect crime against its architect. The people I had written that law to protect were, at this very moment, driving me to a locked psychiatric ward under its authority. Her maneuver was brilliant, and it was built entirely on fraud, forged medical records, chemically induced symptoms, a fabricated narrative. They had weaponized the law against its creator, and in doing so, they had made one fatal error. They assumed that by taking my farm, my phone, and my freedom, they had severed my ability to fight. They thought the game was over. They did not know about the cameras recording every inch of my study. They did not know Marcus Delaney was sitting in his office in downtown Asheville, holding digital copies of their syndicate debts and pristine footage of Bradley looting my safe. And most importantly, they did not know about the small plastic phone resting against my chest. I traced its rectangular outline through the wool with my thumb and made no move to use it. Not yet. First, I had to survive the psychiatric evaluation. And I knew exactly how those evaluations worked. I knew the questions, the cognitive tests, the behavioral markers. With the drugs fully out of my system, my mind was a scalpel again. I would pass their tests flawlessly, and the moment I was alone in a secure room, I would authorize Marcus to drop the hammer. Renee and Bradley believed they had imprisoned me. They had no idea they had just handed me the perfect stage. The van delivered me to Broadview Behavioral Health Center, a high-security facility on the outskirts of the county. I offered zero resistance. Any flash of anger, any assertion of my rights, any demand for an attorney would be documented as combative paranoia. So I let my shoulders slump. I shuffled across the linoleum. I stared blankly at the intake nurses and answered their questions in confused murmurs. They cataloged my belongings, took my vitals, and escorted me down a long, sterile corridor to a private room. The heavy door clicked shut behind me, and the electronic lock engaged with a solid, echoing thud. Through the narrow, reinforced window, I watched a burly orderly take up his post in the hallway. I was officially a prisoner of the state, locked inside a system I had helped design. The room was deliberately sparse, a narrow bed bolted to the floor, a single chair, a small bathroom with no mirror. I sat on the edge of the stiff mattress and waited for 2 agonizing hours while the intake rounds finished, and a deep silence settled over the wing. When I was certain no one was watching through the window, I slipped my hand into the cardigan, drew out the burner phone, turned the screen brightness to its minimum, and shielded it with my body. I typed a rapid message to Marcus, the name of the facility, the ex-parte order, the forged affidavits, the speed of the extraction. His reply arrived in 30 seconds, and the fury behind his words was palpable even in text. They bypassed the standard docket, he wrote. They used the emergency loophole to strip your rights without a preliminary hearing. But that order is only temporary. By law, they must hold a formal evidentiary hearing within 72 hours to make the conservatorship permanent. That gives us exactly 3 days. I stared at the glowing screen and my legal mind shifted into overdrive. 72 hours, a narrow window, but enough. We let them think they've won, I typed back. File nothing, contest nothing. Do not alert their legal team. Let them walk into that courtroom on Monday morning believing I am defenseless. Marcus replied instantly. My forensic accountants have broken through the shell companies. We have the paper trail connecting his firm to the Atlanta syndicate. We have the loan guarantees carrying your forged signature. We have preserved high-definition footage of Bradley opening your safe and photographing your assets. It is irrefutable. We will bury them. One more thing, I wrote. Serve federal subpoenas on the 2 out-of-state neurologists who signed those affidavits. Quietly. They were paid with syndicate money, and when they are looking down the barrel of federal perjury charges and the loss of their licenses, they will crumble. Consider it done, Marcus answered. I slid the phone beneath the mattress and lay back on the stiff bed, staring at the ceiling. For 3 days, I was a model patient. I ate the bland food. I answered the staff psychiatrist's questions with polite, mild confusion, careful to seem diminished but never dangerous. I let them see a harmless, fading old man. And every night in the dead hours, I coordinated the counterstrike one whispered text at a time, laying my trap in the dark of a psychiatric room they believed was my tomb. Monday morning came, and with it, the hearing that was meant to erase Walter Boone from his own life. They transported me to the Buncombe County Courthouse in downtown Asheville under a gray, rain-heavy sky. I had requested, through the facility staff, to be allowed to wear my own clothes to the hearing, and my request had been granted as a small mercy to a confused old man. So I walked into that courtroom in my plain country clothes, my worn-out boots, holding my battered canvas hat in both hands. It was not carelessness. It was costume design. I wanted them to look at me and see exactly what they expected to see. A lost farmer, a broken mind, easy prey, and that is where you found me at the beginning of this story. My daughter smirking at the plaintiff's table. Bradley shaking his head with open contempt. Their high-priced litigator arranging his forged medical exhibits in a thick leather binder. Renee leaned over and whispered something to her husband, and I heard her choked little laugh cut through the chamber. Then the judge entered, and everything they had built began to burn. His name, according to the placard, was the Honorable Alan Whitfield. He settled into his chair, adjusted his glasses, opened the case file, and glanced up at the respondent's table, at me in the routine way judges do 1,000 times a year. His eyes met mine, and the color drained from his face. His hand trembled against the wooden gavel. His lips parted. "My God," he whispered, and the whole courtroom heard it. "Is it really him?" Every head turned. Renee's smile died on her lips. Bradley frowned at the bench, bewildered. Their lawyer froze mid-motion, one hand still resting on his binder of forgeries. "Yes, Alan," I said. And I let my true voice out of its cage for the first time in weeks. It was no longer frail or confused. It rolled through the courtroom in the deep, commanding baritone I had honed across 30 years of prosecuting the most dangerous criminals in this state. It has been a very long time. The sound of that voice hit Renee like a physical blow. I heard her gasp a sharp, ragged intake of air. Bradley went rigid in his chair, the confident smirk wiped clean off his face. Their lawyer's head whipped back and forth between the judge and the supposedly senile vegetable he had spent 20 minutes describing in his filings. "Your Honor," the lawyer stammered, scrambling to his feet, "we have clearly established the respondent's identity and his severe cognitive deterioration in the medical record." Judge Whitfield turned on him with a stare that could have stripped paint. "Sit down, counselor," he said, his voice like rolling thunder. "You have absolutely no idea who is sitting at that table." He looked out across the silent courtroom, but his words were aimed straight at my daughter's paralyzed attorney. 30 years ago, I was a struggling law clerk, and I made a mistake that should have ended my career before it began. That man took me under his wing. He stood up for me when no one else would. He saved my professional life. He drew a breath, and his voice softened into something close to reverence. He is the most ruthless, brilliant, and honorable federal prosecutor this state has ever produced. He authored the very conservatorship statutes you are attempting to use in my courtroom today. He wrote the emergency's ex parte provision you filed on Friday morning. And you are standing there telling me that the architect of this state's elder protection laws has lost his mind? The litigator took a step backward, his composure cracking. He looked down at his binder of forged records, then at Renee, his eyes demanding an explanation she was incapable of giving. "Your Honor," he managed weakly, "we have sworn affidavits from 2 certified medical professionals." Judge Whitfield's palm came down flat on the bench. "I do not care what papers you have in that binder. I know the man sitting in front of me, and this court is going to hear him." The air in the room turned heavy. I sat perfectly still, watching terror take hold of my daughter and her husband, letting the silence crush the remaining breath from their lungs. Then slowly, I opened my fingers. The battered canvas hat dropped from my hand and landed on the polished floor with a soft, dismissive thud. I placed my palms flat on the defense table and pushed myself upward. The stooped, fragile posture I had worn like a second skin for weeks vanished. I drew my shoulders back, lifted my chin, and stood at my full height. The tremor in my hands ceased. My gaze hardened into the cold, penetrating stare that had once made hardened criminals confess in interrogation rooms just to escape it. "Your Honor," I said, my voice cutting through the stillness like a sharpened blade. "With the court's permission, I am formally waiving my right to appointed counsel. I will be representing myself in this matter." Judge Whitfield did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. "Permission granted, Mr. Boone," he replied, his voice thick with respect. "The floor is yours." Right on cue, the heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom swung open with a resounding crash. Marcus Delaney strode into the chamber like an approaching storm, immaculate in his signature charcoal suit, radiating absolute authority. Behind him, two paralegals pushed a metal trolley stacked with 6 large banker's boxes, its wheels squeaking sharply against the floorboards. Marcus marched straight down the center aisle past the plaintiff's table, without granting my daughter or her husband a single glance of recognition, and positioned the trolley beside me. He gave me one grim nod and stepped back. I rested my hand on the top box. "Your Honor," I began, my tone ringing with absolute clarity, "the petition before you today is not a tragic plea for the protection of a deteriorating patriarch. It is the final desperate act of a coordinated criminal conspiracy. The petitioners are attempting to use this courtroom to complete a $15 million fraud." I turned and looked directly at Bradley. His face was slick with cold sweat. He had the look of a man standing on the gallows, listening to the trapdoor being tested. "Opposing counsel has presented sworn affidavits describing my cognitive collapse," I continued, drawing a thick stack of transcripts from the first box and walking it slowly to the bench. "2 independent neurologists," he claims, "diagnosed me with late-stage dementia. What counsel does not know is that my legal team served federal subpoenas on both of those out-of-state doctors this weekend. Faced with perjury charges and the loss of their medical licenses, they proved remarkably forthcoming. Each has confessed in a sworn statement now before you to accepting a $50,000 wire transfer to sign a blank affidavit. Neither man has ever met me, examined me, or spoken to me." The slick litigator looked physically ill. He began quietly packing his briefcase, edging it toward the aisle, desperate to distance himself from the toxic fallout of his own clients. I did not stop. I drew a small, clear evidence bag from my pocket and held it up so the whole room could see the white capsules inside. "The symptoms described in those forged records were real, Your Honor," I said, and my voice grew colder with every word. "Because for the past month, my daughter, the loving petitioner, has been systematically poisoning me. She replaced my daily vitamins with a high-dose antipsychotic, obtained illegally through her husband's associates. An independent, certified laboratory has confirmed the contents of these capsules and the levels in my bloodstream. The tremors, the confusion, the wandering, every symptom in their petition was manufactured in a pill bottle and administered by her own hand every morning with a smile and a kiss on my cheek." Somewhere behind me, I heard Renee begin to hyperventilate. "And the motive, Your Honor, is in these boxes." I laid my hand on the trolley. "Forensic accounting establishing that Bradley Sinclair's venture capital firm is insolvent and indebted to a criminal lending syndicate in Atlanta for millions. Loan guarantees bearing my forged signature, pledging my land and my bonds as collateral for his debts. And finally, high-definition surveillance footage, time-stamped and preserved on independent servers, showing Mr. Sinclair entering my home while he believed I lay drugged and unconscious upstairs, opening my private floor safe with a stolen key, and photographing the deed to my farm, my account numbers, and my signature samples, page by page, for 20 minutes. Marcus's paralegals wheeled a monitor into position, and the courtroom watched, in perfect silence, as Bradley Sinclair knelt on my study floor in crystal-clear video and looted the life of the man whose daughter he had married. When the footage ended, no one moved for a full second. The silence was so profound that I could hear rain lashing the tall glass windows, washing away the tension that had suffocated me for weeks. Judge Whitfield looked down at the plaintiff's attorney, who was still trying to slide his briefcase toward the center aisle. Then he raised his hand and pointed one stern finger across the chamber. He announced that the emergency ex parte conservatorship was revoked, declared null and void from the moment of its fraudulent inception. He stated for the record that the court recognized me as being in full possession of my mental faculties, my autonomy, and my legal rights. And he did not stop there. He ordered the bailiffs to secure the doors, and he issued bench warrants on the spot for the arrest of both Renee Sinclair and Bradley Sinclair. The charges echoed through the chamber like a requiem: severe elder abuse, willful, premeditated fraud, forgery of financial instruments, and most damning of all, the poisoning and chemical imprisonment of a vulnerable senior citizen. He directed the district attorney to freeze every asset connected to Bradley and his shell companies before the close of business. The trap I had laid in the dark of a psychiatric room had fully sprung. The courtroom erupted into chaos. Additional deputies flooded through the double doors. 2 officers hauled Bradley up from the floor where his legs had failed him, dragging him by his cuffed arms as he thrashed and sputtered incoherent pleas, his expensive suit torn at the shoulder. Renee tried to stand and could not. A female deputy instructed her to place her hands behind her back, and she resisted, weeping hysterically, shaking her head as the steel closed around her wrists. Her mascara ran in dark streaks down her pale cheeks. She turned her desperate gaze toward me, opened her mouth to scream, and the deputies were already marching her toward the side exit. Marcus stood beside me, arms crossed, watching the systematic dismantling of the people who had tried to steal my life. We exchanged a single silent nod. The job was not merely done, it had been executed with absolute precision. I walked out of the courtroom with my posture straight and my mind sharper than it had been in decades. In the marble corridor outside, the deputies were escorting Renee toward the transport elevator, and when she saw me, a final wave of frantic energy took hold of her. She fought their grip, threw her body forward, and dropped to her knees on the hard marble directly in my path. The deputies tried to lift her, but she went limp, wrapping her handcuffed arms around my scuffed work boots, sobbing in loud guttural bursts of panic and defeat. "Dad, please," she screamed, her voice echoing down the long, empty corridor. "You have to stop this. You can't let them take me. I'm your daughter. I'm your blood. Please, I am begging you." I looked down at the woman weeping at my feet. I saw the face I had kissed goodnight for 18 years. The eyes that had smiled at me across the dinner table for 3 decades. And I also saw the woman who had slipped poison into my morning coffee and whispered, "Don't fight it, you lost," into my ear, as strangers loaded me into a van. I saw the daughter who kicked her freezing father as he lay on the porch he built. I felt no pity. My heart had become a stone fortress impervious to the tears of a traitor. I did not bend down, I did not raise my voice. I spoke with a quiet, lethal calm that cut straight through her hysterical wails. "You bled that word dry the day you put poison in my cup." I stepped backward, drawing my boots out of her grasp, turned, and walked away down the corridor, the rhythmic thud of my heels echoing off the marble. I did not look back, not even once as her screams faded behind the heavy steel doors of the transport elevator. The justice system moves with remarkable speed when it is fed undeniable evidence and driven by the righteous anger of a furious judge. Within 6 months, the proceedings concluded with devastating finality. Bradley Sinclair was convicted on multiple federal counts of wire fraud, grand larceny, and conspiracy. The Atlanta lending syndicate he served was dismantled by federal authorities using the forensic trails Marcus's accountants had painstakingly mapped. Bradley was sentenced to 15 years in a federal penitentiary, trading his tailored suits for institutional orange, his reputation and his firm reduced to cautionary footnotes. Renee faced her own reckoning. The elder abuse and fraud convictions stripped her of her social standing, her assets, and her freedom. She received a lengthy sentence in a state correctional facility, isolated from every ounce of the luxury she had betrayed her own father to protect. Their greed had been their undoing, a poison far more potent than anything they ever slipped into my coffee. With my enemies behind bars, I returned to the sanctuary of my farm, and I did not simply resume my quiet life. I worked with Marcus to establish a bulletproof legal trust, and I transferred the majority of my portfolio and the deed to the farm into it. The trust exists for one purpose: It funds legal defense and protective services for vulnerable senior citizens trapped in abusive conservatorships. The exact laws I once wrote as a shield and watched my own child sharpen into a sword will never again be turned against the innocent without a fight, not while I have breath and resources to prevent it. It was a crisp morning in early November when I finally allowed myself to feel it all. The sun was rising over the hills, laying long golden shadows across the frost-covered pasture. I carried a steaming mug of black coffee out onto the back porch, and I stood there alone in the cold, clean air, listening to the morning birds, completely and finally at peace. Let me sit with you a moment longer, friend, before we say goodbye, because there are things this ordeal taught me that no courtroom could. The first is that betrayal rarely kicks the door in. It arrives wearing the most familiar face at your table, carrying groceries, calling you dad, hiding greed behind a manufactured mask of concern. The people best positioned to destroy us are always the ones we have handed the keys. And that is precisely why trust must never mean the surrender of your own eyes and ears. Love your family with your whole heart, but verify your bank statements yourself. Keep your own name on your own accounts. Tell your doctor, your lawyer, and one true friend the truth about your life. Isolation is the predator's greatest ally, and it is a door only you can close. The second is about the difference between forgiveness and accountability. In the months after the trial, people asked me whether I would ever forgive Renee. And here is what I have come to believe. Forgiveness is a private act of release. Somewhere down the road, for the sake of my own soul and Eleanor's memory, I may lay down the weight of hating my daughter. But forgiveness does not mean rescue. It does not mean unlocking the cell. Accountability is not the opposite of love. It is the last honest form of it. A parent who shields a child from every consequence teaches that child that consequences are for other people. And I sometimes wonder if I taught Renee exactly that lesson, decades ago, without ever meaning to. The third is for every older person listening to me tonight, and for every son and daughter who loves one. Growing old is not a crime, and grief is not dementia. Do not let anyone, not even the people you raised, convince you that your age has disqualified you from your own life. If someone insists you are confused when your eyes tell you otherwise, write things down. Dates, amounts, conversations. Paper does not gaslight. And if you are the child of aging parents, understand that the greatest inheritance you can leave them is not patience with their decline. It is respect for their dignity while they are still standing. And the last lesson is the oldest one. Never mistake a person's quiet patience for weakness. An old lion may rest in the shade, but his teeth remain sharp, and the truth, however long it is buried, will always burn away the shadows of deceit. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, do me one small kindness. Hit that subscribe button right now, and leave a like so I know you made it here to the end with me. Tell me in the comments, how would you have handled Renee and Bradley? Would you have forgiven them? Or would you have let justice run its full course, the way I did? Turn on the notification bell so you never miss the next story of betrayal, patience, and justice served. Your comments and your company mean more to this old storyteller than you will ever know. This story is a work of narrative fiction, written, edited, and refined by our human storytelling team, drawing on real patterns of elder financial abuse and conservatorship fraud reported across the United States. Names, characters, places, and events are products of creative writing. Any resemblance to actual persons or events is coincidental. We craft each of these stories by hand because we believe the struggles of older people deserve to be told with care, dignity, and a human heart. Thank you for listening, and may you always be surrounded by people who protect you, not people who prey on you.